Ekotürk'ten merhabalar. Bugün çok aslında dünya gündemi için önemli bir konuyu masaya yatıracağız. Döngüsel ekonomi olarak adlandırılan geri dönüşüm ekonomisi olarak da tarif edebileceğimiz ve aslında dünyanın geleceği için son derece önemli olan ama buna rağmen gündemimizde yeterli seviyede yer işgal etmeyen önemli bir konuyu Hollanda'da bu alanda çok önde gelen çalışmalara imza atan Mr. Freek Van Eıjk bizlerle birlikte. How would you define a circular economy and what is the definition and its main principles and its motto and what does it mean to what or how should it mean to the world, a circular economy in general?
So let's say what means circular economy for me. It's often explained as keeping materials in the flow, in the loop, as long as possible and at the highest possible value. Because if you look at the material use we have and the growth of the world population, we simply don't have enough materials to keep up, let's say, using them up to 2050. We would probably need 3 planets. So the idea is by keeping materials in the loop, let's say, we don't have to extract them from the earth again. Now, what do we actually do when we make products? We combine materials, energy and creativity and we make products. And typically what happens at the end of the life cycle, this value is lost. It's it's wasted, and there can even be negative side effects, like plastics, for instance, who arrive in the ocean and are a problem for tourism, for fisheries, and future health problems. But what if we were to retain this value, which let's say, we created at the highest possible level? It's like, imagine that you roll up a ball up a hill, you create value. You want to prevent that this value rolls down the hill again, you want to keep this ball on the top of the hill. You can do that by, for instance, sharing something. Take about your car. You only use a car maybe 6% of the time, and 94% of the time it's not used. What if we could share this car more often, a shared principle, then the use is much better from the same amount of materials. If something is broken, you can repair it and have a longer lifetime. If you cannot repair it, maybe you can refurbish it or remanufacture it. And the last resort in the circular economy, not the first one, is recycling. Then you bring back the materials. But to get this idea of value in a circular economy, as a cell phone, if you recycle it, it's €3 value. If you refurbish it, it's €200 of value. So to keep the value at the highest possible level is very crucial in a circular economy. But in order to do that, you have to think about creating new loops, new collaborations, go back in the supply chain to the assembly and make new connections. So circular economy is a system innovation, if you want.
Even though it's a system and a new maybe business model, but also it's a culture actually, because consumption and production, these are cultures, and we have a very well-established culture of consumption and production. So especially considering the consumption age, how to change both producers and consumers' established culture of consumption and production, because it should be very difficult to change, an established culture.
Well, waste is a resource which lost its way, and we have this culture in which consuming is good and normal, it's a standard. If you want to change them, basically it's like a system change again, and it's also about awareness, also for consumers. Now, sometimes people joke that people over 40, you cannot educate them anymore, but you can educate the kids. And the kids are the consumers of tomorrow, the leaders of tomorrow. And if you implement circular economy at schools and universities, you will see that the demands will be different, that the new business models which come from their generation will be difficult. So it's never too late to start with education. But having said that, there are also new business models which can already work today. So what do you want when you buy a product? Do you want to own it, or do you just want the service? Do you want to own a seat, or do you want to have a place to sit? Do you want to have the ownership of a lamp, or just do you want light? So for instance, business models like products as a service are basically based on that you use the service, what you need, and without you have the ownership and discarding it and sub-optimizing using it. So there are lots of things which can already work today. If you look at food today, 1/3 of all food we produce is wasted. Your grandmother and my grandmother, they didn't waste any food. If you get these habits back into practice and you make it sexy to reuse things or to buy refurbished things, then we would go already a long way. In order to make it work For the people who bring circular products on the market, I would say never do concessions on quality, because if, let's say, circular is considered to be inferior, it will never work. So you have to have the same functionality and better, but with circular economy principles behind it, that the material value gets reused.
Actually, we should just listen to maybe our grandmothers and mothers. Maybe this is the best way to shift to circular economy, because as you said, they never wasted. My mother, my grandmother, and probably your mother and grandmother too. So maybe probably we should just listen to them.
You know this example of service, let's say products as a service. Think about books as a service. How do you call that? It's a library. It's as old as the world. Power by the Hour from Rolls-Royce, they just celebrated their 50th anniversary. So circular economy is not new. In the old farm, nothing was ever lost. Everything was reused. So for us it was easier and cheaper and basically to discard things and buy something new than actually thinking about repairing it, reusing it. And a little bit that's the way our economy is built up. It's a linear economy in which the price incentives are not really good. The price of resources is extremely low and the price of labor is relatively high. So you do not incentivize. And the negative externalities are now not reflected in the price of a product. You don't see that the average tomato in the US has traveled over 600 kilometers, for instance. You don't see the impact on climate change or on the plastic soup in the price of a product. So little by little we have to work on getting those kind of aspects, let's say, in track again. But those are also political, if you will. They are international, so you're talking about trade agreements, climate agreements. On average, on the international level, you're talking about 10 years at least. European regulation, changing European, it's 5 years. And things like taxes, Europe doesn't deal with taxes, that's the individual member state. At the national level, I think changing regulations is between 1 and 3 years. But still, it doesn't mean you can't do anything, because most dynamics are at the local level, at the level of a city, where you can start today and where you can see results within 1 to 3 years in your area, your quarter, which are inspirational and which can be copied to other quarters in a town.
I was going to ask you, you already touched upon that, but I still want to expand that. What are the main motivations for actually producers? Is it more like profit? Because at the end of the day, private companies consider profit, right? So what are the main incentives for private sector? How to encourage them to to make this transition from linear economy to circular economy?
Let me start by quoting the CEO of a Dutch chemical company, DSM. He said, "How can you claim to be successful as a company in a society that fails? You cannot. It's about your future market. If the world goes down the drain, you don't have a market in the future." So if you realize that business as usual is not an option, or that your market will shrink if the world is, let's say, facing all kinds of issues related to resources, you don't have a market. So that awareness, I think, is pretty important. If you look at the speed of innovation, look at market platforms like Airbnb and Uber, how fast that market has grown. So circular economy can become, let's say, market growth. Not that Airbnb and Uber are the best circular examples, but it grows the potential of sharing platforms. If you give your phone a second and third or fourth life with the same amount of materials as a company, then you have more profit from the same amount of materials, so it's also more margin. And if you work in a value chain together and you talk to each other and you're dependent on each other, it's also about risk mitigation. And the last thing is, if you make products, it's also about using less water, less energy, less materials, it's just less cost. And that makes very much business sense. If I would continue down the road of motivation for companies, look at us as consumers. The world is flat. We know what's happening in China, in Vietnam, in Peru. And me, but also the future generation, they want to have guilt-free consumption. When you buy something, you want to make sure that there's no child labor, or there are no blood diamonds, or there's no negative consequence for the environment. So look at the Volkswagen emission scandal, what changed in the automotive sector. Tremendous value has been lost for Volkswagen, and the speed of innovation of every car manufacturer has increased tremendously. The traditional fossil fuel engine car is not an option anymore.
So people are more aware. We can definitely say that. I think.
I think people are more
world.
aware, and the first movers as businesses, they have the biggest market share. Just like Airbnb is now worth more than the whole Hilton group without owning a single apartment. So if you are a first mover as a company, you run in all kinds of barriers, regulatory, access to financing, acceptance by the market, but the opportunities are actually the biggest. And as a company, I would say the advice, don't wait till the market is perfect that you start your circular model, but learning by doing. Start now, learn fast, fail fast, and move on. That's, I think, something which fits very much today's market.
Can you say, like, for your own country, let's talk about your own country, Netherlands, all companies, private sector has shifted to circular economy, or there's still a way to go?
If I look at the Netherlands, I think it started with us with startups, young people with new ideas who said we can do this better and more sustainable. But it started also with the multinationals who are looking ahead at the future markets. The SMEs were a little bit reluctant, they're a little bit waiting. But when our government saw that there was so much action around circular economy from multinationals and startups, they adopted the world's most ambitious circular economy program ever. That the Netherlands is fully circular in 2050, and in 2030, mind you, that's 11 years from now, we want to have half the use of non-renewable resources. So that's a moonshot, that's tremendous. And now that our government is going that way, they have shown the direction. They have 5 priority sectors, and they tweak the system, take barriers away, provide access to financing, work on R&D. That gives confidence to both cities and SMEs, small mid-sized companies, that actually circular economy is something that they should pursue, that they should follow. And you see now lots of movement there as well. Every self-respecting city has now a circular economy roadmap or plans, and they help their local community to start. Because if you look at it, government has a role, I think, to provide direction and the boundary conditions.
Yes, I was just going to ask government role actually. Okay, it's a business and private companies, of course, have responsibility, huge responsibilities.
Businesses, in the end, if you want to scale up, you need businesses. They have to invest, they have to show the guts and actually do the nasty work. But the government can give the direction, like the moonshot of the Dutch government, to be fully circular. They're like the priority sectors. And what they should do is always involve the businesses because they're very dependent on it.
Yeah, for example, I will just give you an example that just came to my mind. In Turkey, there is a new regulation on plastic bags, for example. Now retailers started charging usage of plastic bags, and since then, since I think last January, the usage of plastic bags has dropped by 50%, almost 50%. Yeah. So we need more government, maybe involvement or intervention.
I think it's like again, circular economy is a system change. You need everybody on board, and the role of the government is to give the direction and set up the regulation and the boundary conditions. Because if there are new business models, the game is changing. No, so you have to provide new business models. Regulation is actually looking with old spectacles to new initiatives. And you made regulation maybe 5-10 years ago for a world which was completely different, for business models which was completely different. So now you have to tweak the system in order that you give new opportunities for new business models. So it asks continuous maintenance as a government. So you give the direction, but it's not like a dictatorial step. You go from A to Z and you cannot differ. It's like a voyage, a circular voyage, and every time you have to tweak the system and the boundary conditions to make it work. But at least you know where we're going. You know what the ambition is, and everybody in society knows where you're going there. Inhabitants, businesses, and when they have that trust that your city or your government is going there, the €1 you have, you will invest it in that direction because you think, well, the chance that something will happen there is very likely. And how can a government do that? Give a platform for best practices, for instance, show what's already happening. Also here in Istanbul, so many things are happening. Probably you don't go on circular economy, but you will see that it's tremendous and that's so inspirational. If you recognize that there is a bio-based building, there is a sharing system, there is a product as a service already happening today that inspires people to see, hey, that's actually quite a good idea. Shouldn't we do that ourselves? So best practice is very important. If you want to walk the talk, you want to manage something, you have to measure it. So it would be good to do something like a scan of the opportunities. Where are the most opportunities? Is it building, or is it food, or is it maybe textiles? So map a little bit the relations between companies, like the material platform is doing here in Turkey. Who has excess materials, waste materials, which could be a resource for the other? What are the links? What are the value chain? And could you optimize over the value chain? If you start mapping that, you see lots of opportunities. And not everything is difficult. Some things you can really start to today. Typically everything which has to do with waste management, waste is like water, it goes to the lowest point, so you need regulation, enforcement, and if there's no enforcement, you, let's say, waste finds other ways. So, but things like refurbishing, remanufacturing, you can start with it today. The skill set is there, you give more value to the same amount of materials, you don't need regulation for that, it's completely private driven. So I would say don't look at the difficulties, but look at the opportunities, look where you can start. So in some sectors there's economic momentum, there's just, let's say, the value perspective is hot. In some sectors like plastics, we know that the sustainable aspect of plastics are terrible. So there you have a sustainability driver, which is the focus, and sometimes there's transition readiness. Plastics is a good example, automotive sector is a good example, because they know that business as usual is not an option. So focus also on there where, let's say, you have the most chance of success.
I was going to ask you, you already gave, you already answered that, but I was going to ask you, where do you see Turkey's process shifting to circular economy? And I think it's your second time in Istanbul, in Turkey.
That's right. No, Turkey.
And what are your observations, for example, as a smart city or sustainable city? How do you see Istanbul? And if you compare it to, for example, Amsterdam, what do you see?
Well, I think that if Amsterdam can prove that there are so many opportunities within circular economy and that it gives so much positive energy in society, bottom up, I think Istanbul can quadruple it at least. I see Turkey as a major economic power in the world, in the top 20 GDP, with strong trade relations with lots of countries, bridging east and west, so strategically extremely important. With well-educated people who are also internationally oriented. I think you can do much more than that. I think you can be as a nation a first mover and basically work together with the countries around you to, let's say, to focus on the circular economy opportunities. Istanbul, I think it's the only metropole in the region, the only metropole Europe has. So every city, cities are the places of action. Everything comes together, energy, mobility, housing, food, water. It's where people interact. And that's the places where you have most circular economy opportunities. Not at the national level, at the city level, it's the place of action where you see the results within 1 or 2 years, where people can get inspired because it's from the people from Istanbul, for the people of Istanbul. So it's non-political, it's not from the left or from the right, it's about doing something better, creating value and improving your own environment.
How do we get rid of traffic? You've seen probably traffic in Istanbul. And it's a waste, it's another kind of waste, oil. It's a bad thing and it's negatively affecting the nature as well. So how do we get rid of that traffic? Do you have any clue or do you have any tip for us?
Well, let's say what I said before, we only use our car maybe 6% of the time, and the rest of the time it's standing idle on a parking place. So concepts like car sharing or mobility as a service, that could work here as well. Good public transportation, so expanding the metro lines, which I think quite some things have happened since the last time I was here.
So we have already, but still people are, insisting on using their own cars. So I don't know how to change this and how to get rid of traffic. Actually, I don't know. Well, if you know, please let me know. So
if you look like a city like Amsterdam, they just announced that they will double the parking tariffs. But it's not only fining; you should always provide an alternative. Yeah. So making sure that there are parking places at the center, at the let's say the border of the town, with a transport alternative. So like a transfer station in a way. So people can leave the car somewhere for free and there is very cheap access to the center. Then you provide an alternative.
Which is cycling for Amsterdam, probably.
Cycling, yes, of course, because that keeps people healthy as well. So those are other societal benefits. Now, just zoom in a town like Istanbul. Probably, like every other town, 50% of all the space of a town is related to mobility, roads, parking places. What if you were to give back to the city 20% of that space, which is now used for parking and for roads? The quality of life would increase tremendously. You can have more walking areas, you can have parks. Istanbul is a blue city, but it's not so much a green city. So if you could give back some green lungs to the city, it would be wonderful. From parking to park. So those are ideas which I think could work as well.
Which city is, from your own perspective, do you think the best example or best model in the world?
Well, if you talk about circular economy, because there are smart cities, there are sustainable cities, and there are circular cities.
Those are different things.
Those
right?
are different things. Smart cities are more, let's say, with the digital technology. Sustainable cities are more and circular economy is more keep the resources in the loop. But they're often very much related.
Yes.
I think Amsterdam has a great work going on. And they're really good in involving the stakeholders. If you just look, circular economy is much more than waste, but they have specific programs for 14 different kinds of waste programs on how to give value to that and make something of higher value with it. But it's also about discussions about mobility. And one side they use economical instruments like forbidding old kind of trucks to enter the city, to have let's say, certain timings when trucks are allowed to enter the city and certain times that they're forbidden to enter the city, increasing alternatives like charging points for electrical cars, raising the parking tariffs and providing transfer stations, hubs at the border of the city. So it's basically the carrot and the stick that they use to go in the desired direction and involving as much people as possible to think with them, with challenges, with hubs, to create a difference. Glasgow is another nice example where they made an inventory around circular economy, where they also mapped the potential and they looked at the specific, let's say, industry strengths. They make beer. So, for instance, they use old bread from bakeries, which was thrown away. Now they use it to make a special kind of beer. So. If you look at your specific footprint as a city and your industrial footprint, you can work on that. Some cities might be a plastic valley, others might be in, let's say, an agro-food valley around the city. There's lots of dynamics in cities which have a building challenge. 50% of building materials often end up in landfills, whereas at the same time you need the same building materials to make new buildings. Can't you use it one for the other? And that's actually possible, and that's, I think, at least 7 cities in the Netherlands are already proving that with a city deal around building. Maybe around circular economy. For me, circular economy, it's another way of designing, another way of producing, another way of consuming, and another way of dealing with waste. It's keeping the materials as long and as high as with highest value as high as possible in the loop. But just focusing on materials wouldn't be enough. If you really want a circular economy, you also have to think about renewable energy, respect for biodiversity, and social equality. So circular economy is really like a system change, but one that can happen today.
And it takes time, of course, and probably, I mean, your last time in Istanbul was, speaking of Istanbul, like I think
it's 16 years ago, indeed.
So maybe after like 16 years later, you will see a maybe major change, or I mean, it takes time to, shift.
It takes time.
Yeah.
But let's say, let that not be an excuse. At the international level, probably you need at least a generation to change things. Think about the dynamics of climate change. At the local level, you can start today. And within 3 months...
Let's start with what, for example? Can you give me one advice? So from here, I will just, going back to work, I will do that. Just give me one tip and I will start doing that starting from today. One advice.
Let's say if you want to really make a major impact, of course you have to separate your waste better at home, especially the plastics and things like that. But if you eat one day a week less meat, your footprint probably is much better. So eating meat is underestimated, but that's very cultural as well.
Yeah, in Turkey, and we are, we
so
love kebab.
Not the easiest part to start with, but you can do a lot if you are just more aware of what are the possibilities. And the next time you want to buy something, think: do I want to own the product or just use the service? But in the mobility, I think lots of opportunities are probably already possible today. And other things, I think the speed of innovation and the startups also here in Turkey are very active to make it happen. So.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.